ado, I want to welcome everyone to the Becoming Bohemian Book Club. Thank you all for joining the discussion. I want to give special acknowledgement and thanks to our guest expert, Brandon, from the Beat Museum here in San Francisco. And thank you so much for spending your evening with us, Brandon. Would you maybe just take just a couple of minutes and introduce yourself? And maybe your connection to the world of literature, and in particular, the book On the Road by Jack Kerouac.
Well, I mean, you've made most of my introduction for me. I've been working at the Beat Museum for about 11 years now. Let's see, I think I first read On the Road in 2002. I'd recently moved to San Francisco to go to school, and was turned on to the Beat generation in general by mutual friends and stuff, and read the book, and it's certainly one of my favorites. And yeah, I'm not exactly sure what else to say.
I think I've heard a rumor somewhere that you were a poet. Is that true? Is that fact?
I write some things. I wax poetic now and again.
Well, maybe if we're lucky, I don't know, if you have anything to share at the end of the club. I'm sure we have people who would love to hear your work.
We'll see.
Okay. See how it goes. Alrighty. So I guess first impressions of the book. It was my first time reading Kerouac, and I did like it. However, it was a little bit challenging, I think, to get through, as it's not your typical narrative. And I know talking to some of my friends in the Becoming Bohemian community, they said, they had some similar responses as well, where they liked it, and it felt like it was punctuated with some really good pieces of just like gems of great writing. But it's not that traditional narrative, and so it's a little easy, I think, to get lost in there. And and so because it's not a traditional narrative, I thought, maybe to guide the discussion, to sort of give us a roadmap for a discussion tonight, I would sort of break things down into themes that I saw in the book, and themes that we also highlight often on the blog Becoming Bohemian. So art themes, philosophy themes, expanding art to not only visual but music as well. And so I wanted to kind of kick it off maybe with music, and talk about some of the kind of musical themes and threads that are woven throughout Kerouac's tale. And I guess it's pretty obvious through the writing that Kerouac was a fan of jazz music. And I think, I guess I would ask you, Brandon, like how much do you think Kerouac was influenced by jazz, and both in the book and kind of through his life, and how maybe the beats and that whole movement was drawn to jazz and influenced by jazz?
Well, I think the key, you're on the right track there. I think that the key fundamentally to understanding Kerouac and to understanding the Beat generation as a whole is jazz. That was the soundtrack of that era, and that wasn't just an accident either. It was I like to think that there's an adage that there's nothing quite as powerful as an idea whose time has come, basically. And jazz was seemed like On the Road itself to kind of capture the cultural zeitgeist. When you think about what these people were doing in this historical context, these are people that were born circa 1920. Kerouac was born in 1922. So when you think about that, what their lives had been up until that point. Jack Kerouac hit the road in 1947, was born in 22. So that gives you kind of a bookend there, so to speak. So you don't really remember the first decade, or maybe a decade is a little bit much, but you don't remember the early part of your life. Uh, the 1920s were a relatively prosperous time in the history of the U.S. And however, once these people had kind of started to become aware of the world around them, they were pretty much already in the throes of the Great Depression. And so that followed through the 30s until World War II, and then you have World War II. And so when you think about what that meant in terms of their life experience, this was kind of one calamity after another, one really difficult situation after another. And so once the war was over, once World War II was over, and you were kind of free to take that great big sigh of relief and move freely about the country, move freely about the world, there was a sense of restlessness amongst this generation. And that was really kind of, when I say the cultural zeitgeist of that time, I would argue that restlessness was really the essence of that. And how of course does that relate to jazz? Well, I mean, jazz represented a spontaneous form of music. When you think about like the structure of a jazz piece, you have a standard. You have some old song, some of which nobody even remembers who wrote, because it's that old. But so the band starts off playing a song, and then they start to diverge into solos and improvisations, and that, what I'm getting at here, and I realize I'm kind of mincing words, but that standard, that song, that written piece of music is like your road.
Mm-hmm.
And then those divergences represent these side streets, and these places that you veer off into as you're seeking something different or something more. And that's what the Beat Generation was really trying to do. And so, of course, jazz makes perfect sense, as the soundtrack of that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess I can see that.
Did I carry or?
Yeah, I love that. No, I love that metaphor too of the road and kind of having that base, that fundamental sort of line of music being sort of the road and kind of carrying you on it. It reminds me of the jazz that I've heard in kind of the jazz district of San Francisco in the Fillmore. It's you'll have these interesting, like you'll have a saxophone kind of improvisation, and is it called ska? When a singer will just kind of like go off and completely improv. And
yeah, I think is what you're thinking of.
Yes, yeah, there we go. Thank you.
Not singing, yeah.
Yeah. I think you see that very much in the kind of loose narrative, in the very kind of creative ferocity of Kerouac's writing, and this sort of creative just push where I guess legend has it he literally sat at a typewriter and typed one long, almost like run-on sentence, leaving out grammatic kind of conventions, and 120 some odd feet later he had this original scroll manuscript that I think it kind of reminds me of some of those saxophone solos that you'll hear where they just kind of go off and they allow their creativity and their imagination to just kind of take them to interesting places. And I think this book definitely does take you to a lot of interesting places. I think Ginsberg, one of the other, main sort of horsemen of the Bohemian Beat Generation, and a poet himself, I think he said Kerouac's poetic sensibility as a modality was like a modality of consciousness, and that Kerouac himself called it spontaneous prose. So I think that definitely kind of ties in with jazz, just as you were saying, it was sort of spontaneous. And
I think it's worth noting, if I may, I think it's worth noting that that the spontaneous nature of the prose often belies how hard he worked to get to work jazz rhythms into that writing. I think you know, when people think of stream of consciousness, they think of this first thought, best thought idea. You know, the first thing that comes to the top of your head, put that down. And yeah, Kerouac was about that. He definitely subscribed to that school of thought. In fact, since you mentioned Ginsberg, he and Ginsberg sparred often, with Jack insisting, "No, Alan, you know, don't edit your poetry. You know, keep it in its purest form." And you know, Alan insisted on editing things. And of course, you know, Kerouac's work was edited by the editors and his publishers and stuff as well. But uh, the point is, you know, when he sat down during that 3 weeks at the typewriter to pound out that scroll, there was this process of, you know, feeling jazz, having a sense of that. I think the word that you used to describe Ginsberg's description here, that he called it a modality of consciousness, and Kerouac called it spontaneous prose. I think Kerouac really he saw his style as writing the way that people think.
Mm-hmm.
Because you don't think, I mean, I certainly don't think, nor do I talk, as you can plainly see, in complete sentences. There's always those divergences, just like, you know, the metaphor I used earlier with the road and the side streets and the, you know, the improvisations in jazz. That's exactly the way that people think. So his idea was, well, let's cut out the middleman, let's cut out the formalism and get right to the vein of what we're trying to say and what we're trying to feel.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I really like that. Just cut through everything, zero in, crystallize our very thoughts, and write them down. I think I also heard a rumor as well, that he, in the original scroll, now the version I read was an edited version, it was not the original scroll, and in the original scroll...
You read the classic edition then.
I did read the classic edition, exactly.
Okay.
And in the original scroll, that there was, he used the word met twice, like I met Dean, right, or Neil Cassidy, right, Dean, and that this person was saying that that was almost intentional, because I think it's, is it called automatopoeia in the English language, when a word sounds like what it is, like the word.
Yeah, that's automatopoeia.
Flush, yeah. And so this person was saying that the met was intentional, like it was supposed to be the sound of a car like backfiring, like an old car that Kerouac would have been using at the time. That it was
I hadn't heard that, but that's plausible.
Yeah, that it was actually there as kind of like this, you know, this kind of sound, to bring sort of sound into the writing and bring sound into the manuscript. I also heard that, I think it was Jim Canary, who is the conservator of the scroll. He said he treated the typewriter very much like the keys of a saxophone, and that it was a very physical act. You know, writing was a physical act, kind of like, and you know, the typewriter keys kind of look like the keys on a saxophone. I thought that was really interesting too.
Right.
That kind of tied into to jazz as well.
He also treated writing like an athletic event. I mean, he was a football player, and you know, when he sat down to write that scroll, you know, he treated every day like he was prepping for a football game. He would get up, he would have a nice, you know, balanced breakfast, you know, brew himself a pot of coffee, do some exercises actually, and then sit down, you know, roll up his sleeves and go to work, and just exhaust himself at that typewriter until he couldn't think straight, and then he would go to bed. He'd wake up, you know, refreshed, and then begin the very next day.
Interesting. Yeah, I can see, like, he was the kind of writing, it reminded me at points a little bit of Hemingway. Like, it was he attacked that typewriter, and so it was very athletic, very physical.
Hemingway used to stand up at his desk. He didn't believe in being seated while writing. So
No, that's interesting. I never knew that about him.
plus,
Uh,
we're talking about a manual typewriter. Have you ever typed anything on an old Underwood number 5?
it is tough. Yeah, we
It's
had
a
one in my.
chore.
It is. It's cardiovascular for sure, for sure.
But you
Um,
end up what's kind of funny there's pictures that were taken later in his life where you can see his fingers, and his fingers are just like, I mean, part of it might be because he might be frankly swelling because he was an alcoholic, but
yeah.
his fingers are just beefy, like like a football player, like a butcher or something, Um, he just, you could tell that he built up some considerable muscle.
Mhm. I think. Wow, interesting, fascinating. So, speaking of music and kind of moving forward, would you say that modern rap music today was influenced by the Beat movement? Because it seems like Kerouac would go off on these kind of almost rap music lyrical riffs at points in the book. Um, what do
Well,
you?
what's interesting is uh, the term that they used in the nomenclature at that time for kind of going off on a spontaneous speech was rapping. Before there was, like, before the name for the musical genre was ever coined, like decades before the musical genre was ever coined, that was called rapping. People to this day who knew Neil Cassidy talk in excited terms about hearing Neil go off on one of his raps, where he would, he could be talking about philosophy, he could be talking about, um, the woman he hooked, or man he hooked up with the night before. He could be talking about, doing 90 down the highway. It could be really anything under the sun, but he would go off on these raps, and they would last anywhere from a few minutes to whatever. And so I think that definitely, that term was uh, something that existed in the popular consciousness before the creation of rap music. I think that, I mean, as far as the beat generation in general having an effect on the creation of the genre, I think absolutely. However, I would give poets like Bob Kaufman, or even like Ted Jones, more credit for that than I would Kerouac in particular. I think, not to veer too far off topic and into Kaufman, but um, uh, Jack and Bob definitely both knew one another. He also knew Ted Jones in New York. But I think what Bob did that was interesting was he took what Kerouac and what Ginsberg were doing with the spontaneous prose and all that, and kind of took it to its logical conclusion. Just kind of like in the same way as like Hemingway's minimalism,
Mhm.
that Bob did it often without paper, without actually writing anything down. He would often compose things just off the top of his head, and he was known to wander around North Beach kind of mumbling poems, and or he would stand up in front of a jazz band and just improvise. And that was kind of like, people who were scholars of music. Uh, like if you read Murray Baraka's book Blues People, he references sort of the chronology of black music in America, and that's what the book's about. But he talks a lot about how the beats have an influence, and that spontaneous thing kind of trickled forward.
Interesting, interesting. Um, so then moving on into sort of philosophical and literary connections, it seems, throughout the book, there is this concept of it, that is referred to kind of constantly, this pursuit of it. And kind of wrapped up in that, what I read into it was that there was kind of this existential angst going on. And I don't know if it was contextual, like you were saying, from the historical context of, it's post-war America. They're just kind of coming out. I mean, they're still kind of in an economic depression. There's a lot of joblessness going on. And I would imagine a lot of kind of, existential angst that's kind of wrapped up in that, along with maybe some of Camus' sort of absurdity that they're experiencing too, that, everything feels absurd. And so we need to seek it, something that is sort of this redemptive, elusive it. And I don't know, what would you say that it is?
I'd say you're right on point there. Yeah, I'm not even sure if I have much more to add. That's basic. That was basically it. It was I think when they say it, it's finding something real, finding something, finding something worth a damn. Frankly, yeah, something meaningful, something, when they set out on the road. The idea of doing that without really any firm purpose or direction, or tangible purpose or direction, that itself was kind of a revolutionary act at that time in history. Because, like I said, going back to World War II, when, we were rationing gasoline and metal and rubber and things like that, the idea of taking a road trip, just, driving off into the sunset, was considered unnecessarily wasteful and even like unpatriotic. And so what was interesting was that it wasn't just the Beat generation who were taking these road trips either. In the continuing throughout the 50s, you've probably seen those old brochures for vacations to the Grand Canyon or to the Mount Rushmore or whatever. There were a lot of people that had this urge to, go forth and, light out for the territories, as Mark Twain said, and just kind of see what there was to see. And so, I think that was another element that, once again, sort of captured the cultural zeitgeist. That the fact that these guys were, jumping in the car. And if you remember the part in On the Road where Neil sort of shakes Jack awake, and he says, he's like, "Come on, man, we got to go." And Jack sort of groggily, he's like, "Well, where are we going?" And Neil's like, "I don't know, but we got to go." That was sort of, a lot of coming from a World War II context. You can imagine how, like, what a sense of freedom that would be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I love, a lot of they're never. It's always just kind of another trip away. It's always just another town down the road. And there's always this hunger and this drive to find it. And I think that's the thing about road trips that are wonderful is, as you go through and you see landscapes, there is this kind of, I don't know, the special thing that happens when you're in nature, and kind of driving through nature. And I think I kind of felt there were some passages in the book that reminded me a little bit of Thoreau, even in his his writings on Walden Pond, and also his civil disobedience writings. But I really thought
and Jack was definitely aware of both of those, by the way.
So he those were kind of part of, would you call them like the Beat Bible or Beat canon of scripture? Would you say that maybe Thoreau would make that list of?
Yeah, I mean that's corroborated pretty well, that Kerouac was certainly aware of Thoreau and was an admirer of Thoreau, and he'd read on civil disobedience, he'd read Walden. One of the interesting things that sort of brings up is, once again, I think for a lot of people, the spontaneous nature of the prose tends to belie what a what an just an extraordinarily well-read person Kerouac was, and all of the tropes and the references and the themes that he invokes from other literature in On the Road. He's one of the things the beats in general, and I think realistically probably every literary movement is fond of cherry picking references from throughout the literary canon, but I think the beats do it in a way that's very most of the time anyway, it's very unpretentious, and he sneaks things in there that unless you're you know reasonably well read, you would totally miss. So if that helps at all, I think you're on the right track.
Yeah, I love what it says about it, going back to kind of that existential angst in it, on page 43 of this version, the classic version that I have. I know the pagination is a little different depending on who published it, but I love what Sal says. That last thing is what you can't get, Carlo. Nobody can get to it. That last thing. We keep on living in hopes of catching it once and for all. And I think it's interesting how it is both kind of in some ways the irritant, right? It's this elusive thing, but then also maybe the balm for existential angst, just that knowledge that keep on living, we keep on existing in the hopes that someday we will find that elusive it, we'll be able to get it. And would you say that one of the things that I thought was really fascinating is there's this theme of hunger that kind of goes through the book. It seems they're all, once he'll come back to his aunt's house after a long trip, he's eating a lot of pie. Like, it seems like pie came up quite a bit throughout the book, and food, and kind of this hunger. He's hungry all the time, and especially towards the end with poor Dean and his sort of state, he just seems, in his sort of homelessness and his hunger, he really is very physically hungry. But I think, metaphorically speaking, that there is kind of that larger picture that he paints for us of this hunger and this striving to find it, to find the meaning of existence. I love you. A couple of the other literary figures that he'll kind of just, like you said, he kind of barely sort of nods at it and touches on it. At the very beginning, towards the beginning anyway, one of the most, I think, regularly quoted pieces of the book that does sort of give a nod to Goethe is when he says, "They rushed down the street together, digging everything in the early way they had, which later became so much sadder and perceptive and blank. But then they danced down the streets like dingle-doties, and I shambled after, as I've been doing all my life, after people who interest me, because the only people for me are the mad ones, the ones who are mad to live, mad to talk, mad to be saved, desirous of everything at the same time, the ones who never yawn or say a commonplace thing, but burn, burn, burn like fabulous yellow Roman candles exploding like spiders across the stars. And in the middle, you see the blue center light pop, and everybody goes, ah, what do they call such young people in Goethe's Germany? And so he kind of, will sort of bring Goethe in just briefly, but he doesn't spell it all out for you. He doesn't say what they called those people in Goethe's Germany. And we know they called, that time of Goethe's Germany kind of got that the Sturm and Drang, and the kind of storm and drive, and Goethe wrote, the young Werther, which kind of talks about that Werther fever. And so I really liked that it's a dense book. I mean, it's not, page-wise, it's not crazy long. We're at, just under 300 pages, but it is just so full of these little kind of forks in the road, right? Where you could just go down a lane just from one, 2 words at the end of a sentence, Goethe's Germany with a question mark, and suddenly you're like, oh, what does he mean by that? And you're off on your own little journey. I
Right.
really did appreciate that. Yeah, I had a lot of fun with that. Um,
You
so
find
would
that a
you?
lot with the beats in general, that you know, if you gloss certain things in, whether it's in a novel or in a poem, um, I think William Burroughs makes a lot of just sort of almost offhand references to just other seemingly unrelated sets of knowledge, and it's a lot of what you find in beat work is kind of the tying together of seemingly unrelated things. You find that in Corso's poetry, for example. This he'll be talking about, um, he'll include references to the classics and, like, serious studied references to the classics, but he'll be speaking in jive,
Mhm,
and it's just interesting that way.
mhm. Yeah, I love
Scrolling
it.
through Wikipedia and clicking links, you wind up reading about Kerouac, and you're on to astrophysics 30 minutes later.
Of
It's
course.
crazy.
It's so true. It's so true. Um, so would you say, his way of kind of just weaving, just speaking exactly what's on his mind, it kind of hints also and nods to maybe Virginia Woolf, a female author from a century earlier. Would you say that maybe she influenced him at all?
I've been I'm not sure if I can corroborate that, so I can't say for sure, but I think it's certainly possible. I mean, he was certainly aware of her work. Um, and I think that's, yeah, that's definitely possible.
Okay, so moving on, I think we've touched on literary figures quite a bit here now. So moving on to art and art connections. So when I visited your museum, the Beat Museum, recently, I couldn't help but notice right as you enter, go through the turnstile, I think that's what it's called. There's like the sign for the Beat Museum, and then you have an abstract expressionist work, looks like a Pollock work, right next to it. And I have to think the art historian in me, that was my undergrad degree, has to draw parallels there. I see a lot of abstract expressionism in his writing, and the two were contemporaries. So did they know each other? Were the Beats aware of the kind of abex movement that was going on in art? What would you say to that?
Absolutely. You're actually you're more on track than you know. Um, Not only were they, completely aware of one another, uh, you know, I would say that just as important as jazz was, for the reasons you know I discussed earlier, that spontaneity, that energy and expression, uh, that's, right on par with jazz. In fact, Jackson Pollock and Jack Kerouac knew one another. They were drinking buddies at the White Horse Tavern in New York. Um,
Nice.
they evidently would, were often found, knocking back a cold one together. And so, they were certainly they were more than a little aware of one another.
They were throwing back Jack together. Yeah. Little Jack Daniels.
Possibly, very possible.
No, that's awesome. Wow, very, very cool. I didn't realize the connection was that strong. That's really interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no, that's a very astute observation, because yeah, it's what's interesting is that at that time, this was a relatively small circle of people, and if you were like on that bohemian scene in New York, in the Village or thereabouts, all these people knew one another, or for the most part. Whether they got along was a different matter, and it wasn't like Pollock and Kerouac, or Kerouac and de Kooning, or anybody were like particularly close, I don't believe. But if you frequent the same drinking establishment, you in a place like that, you wind up running into kind of the usual suspects. And I think that was sort of the, more or less the basis of their relationship.
Interesting. Yeah, there seems to be a shared philosophy. I feel like reading Kerouac, I understand Pollock a little bit better, actually. I think his way of writing is very similar to Pollock's way of painting and action painting. Like we were, for all the reasons you mentioned earlier, the sort of athletic writing and the athletic painting, I think, just go together so well. It's cool. That's really cool to hear that they were chummy at the White Horse Tavern. Awesome. So that also leads me to, I guess, the next area I want to discuss is the only area that made me a little bit uncomfortable while I was reading. I guess, being a woman, and I would say Gloria Steinem's kind of my homegirl. Like, I am a bit of a feminist. There were some moments where the treatment of women in his book, I would say predominantly the treatment of women in the book was not always the best. At least, was not good. All the way up, towards the end, obviously the worst, when you have, Dean, punching, his wife so hard that, or ex-wife at the time, I believe, so hard that his thumb, breaks and it becomes infected, and and so there's like domestic violence in there, and then there's a lot of this, there's a lot of kind of the, I guess you could say, objectification of women. But trying to be open-minded, I tried to put my Gloria Steinem, my Jane Fonda, women in media like brain on hold for a little bit, just to understand. I think one thing I found interesting was that it seemed like their pursuit of women in relationships did tie in an interesting way with their pursuit of it. Anyway, I'll just leave my little commentary at that, but I want to hear kind of your thoughts on maybe the treatment of women in the book, and then also just in the beat movement broadly.
Well, I mean, that's a subject that comes up frequently, more than frequently, frankly. And I mean, myself, I absolutely consider myself a feminist, and so that can be a difficult thing to square, and to kind of reconcile. I think that number one, I should probably start by saying that question alone is its own conversation. I mean, that's a much bigger thing. But to cut to the chase and kind of just hit a few, like a few points there. I think that that absolutely the treatment of women is problematic. It's anywhere from obnoxious to at times disgusting, to be perfectly frank. I think that what's interesting is that you have to think about what Kerouac was trying to do, and I don't think it necessarily absolves him of anything. I think his relationships, and I don't know how much you read about his biography beyond just On the Road, but his relationships with women were pretty much universally troubled. I often joke with visitors to the museum that I love the guy's writing, but he's not the kind of guy that I want to introduce to my sister. That's kind of funny, but it's also quite serious. I think that it raises these questions of what's an author's life, and to what extent does his life affect his work? To what extent can you forgive certain things like that for the sake of what's being said in the work? I mean, since we brought up, since we've talked about Hemingway and stuff. Hemingway's relationships with women were also fraught with problems, and he wasn't always the greatest guy himself. But I think one of the things that they were trying to do, meaning the Beat generation as a whole and Kerouac specifically, was capture their times as honestly and forthcomingly as possible. And I think with that, you sort of have to, it would have been disingenuous of him not to include the treatment of women as he did. Whether that was conscious, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily hand him the feminist card and say, oh, he was doing that to highlight the problems or anything. Absolutely not. But at the same time, he was portraying his interactions with his friends and with his lovers and with everybody in between as honestly as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And in many ways, the beats were quite progressive, even by today's standards. There was a in what was arguably one of the most segregated times in American history, on the basis of class and gender and race and pretty much anything you can think of. There was a kind of this great coming together during the period of the Beat generation, where you had people mixing circles essentially, and that was quite progressive for its time. But at the same time, you have to remember this was the 1950s. Actually, this was not even the 1950s. This was the 40s, and you can try and you can appreciate people for being forward thinking, but you can't ever pluck them out of their times and put them in the current ones. That's just part of just accepting historicity, and I think it's when you consider questions like young people reading books like On the Road Today, how is a teacher to talk about those relationships and stuff, and I think the best answer is honestly what I just said, that you don't want to forget where you came from. You don't want to forget what's the progress that we've made, and that's been a long, hard road for a lot of people. You mentioned Gloria Steinem, and that's she was one of the people putting in work. I would also, if you're interested in Kerouac and sort of the female voice in that circle, I think one of the people you should really read is Joyce Johnson. Now, Joyce Johnson was, do you remember the part in On the Road when they wake up in New York, and then we went down to the corner store for the New York Times, and suddenly I was famous? Mm-hmm. I'm paraphrasing, but it's more or less something like that. The woman that he was with was Joyce Johnson. They dated for a brief time between 57 and 58. And what's really interesting is that her writing is very forthcoming in terms of the experiences, both her experience as a woman on the beat scene, in her 20s in this whole new world of kind of rebellion and all this, but also the experiences of other women that she was close to, people like Elise Cowan, who unfortunately is probably best remembered as the woman that Ginsberg dated when he was experimenting with being straight. She's gracious and compassionate, but also very forthcoming about the battle of the sexes at that time, and it's definitely worth a read. Her novel Minor Characters deals a lot with that, and in fact the version that's currently in print has a photograph of Kerouac on the front, and she's they're outside of a bar called the Kettle of Fish in the Village over, I think, on Christopher Street, um, and she's like in the background, slightly out of focus, and it's. I thought the cover design was really interesting because it's um, it illustrates exactly what she's talking about in the novel. That she was very much aware that as a woman on the scene, she was sort of playing second fiddle to the men she was associated with, but she kind of almost uses that to her advantage. And I think it's a really it's one that's definitely worth reading, and I think she's terribly underrated. So go ahead and read her. But
and I'll link to the book and on Facebook as well for our listeners to read as well. Interesting. Thank you for the tip. I always love a good book recommendation. So appreciate.
Like you said, it's there's all these references in this stuff, and that leads you down some sort of tangent. So that's definitely one that's very worthwhile.
Thank you. One thing I did like, there was one part of the book that I really liked when they're talking to Sal's aunt, I think, and let's see if I can find it. Or talking about her. My aunt once said, the world would never find peace until men fell at their women's feet and asked for forgiveness. And I thought that was interesting,
Yes.
An interesting statement. And he says, but Dean knew this. He'd mentioned it many times. And he goes on to talk about Mary Lou. And then they say the truth of the matter is we don't understand our women. We blame on them, and it's all our fault. And I thought that was kind of an interesting, just an interesting piece there that was very much more modern thinking. And I guess what I liked about it and how I was also able to kind of reconcile the treatment of women in the book was that I think all of us just contain multitudes within us. I like to say, I think that's the beauty of being human, right? There is the good side of our nature. There's the light side, and I did add a little bit of maybe too much light over here because I realized things were getting dark here in San Francisco. There's also the dark. We all have our dark sides. We have the better parts of our nature and then maybe not so great. And I don't know that I even want to characterize it as the not so great. I think there are lots of different sides of ourselves, and that is part of being human. And I think you see that through the book. You'll see the kind of, in some ways it is a cautionary tale, like we talked about, of what can happen when you maybe, mistreat women, or what can happen if you maybe use drugs and alcohol too much. I mean, you see that in Kerouac's life, his death due to complications associated with alcohol. You see these kinds of things that happen that, maybe not the best outcomes, right? Suboptimal outcomes, but there's something in some ways endearing about the person who is real and the person who is raw. And that's what I think I loved about Kerouac. And in spite of some of the misogyny and the objectification of women, I did like that there was this honesty to this sort of dualistic, these two sides or multiple sides, many sides of his own character. And I think that is something that we see in all of us. And so I was able to kind of forgive him a little bit at points for his treatment of women, I think, because it just was an interesting insight into his character in the same way that you see a lot of Russian novels and Russian authors in books like Crime and Punishment, Lolita, others, where you are able to kind of see depth of character and insight into the human experience that you wouldn't if they were Pollyanna all the time, completely straight arrow all the time. And so that's why I think, I don't know, I was able to get through it when there were points when I wanted to throw the book across the room.
Once again, I think you're more on track than you know. That's interesting that you invoke the Russian authors, people like Dostoevsky and stuff, because Kerouac was very aware of those people, and he was aware of that. I think that becomes apparent in some of his later novels, like Big Sur and Vanity of Douloise and stuff. But that sort of introspection into the darker or more uncomfortable parts of the human psyche, and like you said, we contain multitudes. And I think that Kerouac was also, moreover, um, uh, he was a lifelong and quite devout Catholic. And I think that one of the really interesting things about Christianity in general, and its role in his life and his understanding of it, is that there's a lot of emphasis in Christianity in general and in Catholicism in particular, um, on the nature of morality as something that we aspire to, but we don't necessarily reach. And it's like uh, the passage that you quoted or paraphrased, that about men falling down on their knees and begging women for forgiveness. That shows an awareness of, like, yeah, we probably don't really treat women all that well, and knowing that, but doing that is a different story. And I think that's something that's that's worth sort of pointing out, is there is that sort of duality that I think Kerouac himself, and this becomes apparent in, like, a little bit further down the road in books like Desolation Angels and again in Big Sur, that he had a very quite a high-minded concept of the man he wanted to be, but also this realization that he was indeed a very flawed individual. And I think that's something that I remember when I was when myself I was first getting into Kerouac. I was also reading a lot of Dostoevsky, and kind of drawing the parallels there, with the sort of the unreliable narrator, somebody that is sort of struggling with his own sanity or his own morality. So
yeah, I like how you mentioned religion and Catholicism. I think religion, definitely, some religions have a lot to apologize for as well, for the treatment of women. I do like an Augustine quote. I do like an Augustine quote. I think it's attributed to Augustine anyway, St. Augustine, where he said, like, "Lord, make me pure, but not yet," right? And so it's this idea of, like, we have, just as you were saying, these aspirations of wanting to be better, and trying to be holier, right, than we are now. But then there is that "but not yet," where we're like, oh, we kind of like a little bit of our vices as well. We do we have the hope and the desire to be pure, but not yet. And I think you see that, in Jack's character, just as you were highlighting, and then also in the Russian novelists, in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, you see that a lot, and also in Lolita, as well, and other Russian authors, Tolstoy as well. I think probably, moving on, speaking of gender, to some other elements that I noticed. I did notice, and I know you brought up Ginsberg, playing it being straight. I did notice there were some homoerotic elements in, the book, as a special relationship between Dean and Sal, or Neil Cassidy and Jack Kerouac, if we were to take that more autobiographical kind of approach to it. You see it kind of throughout the novel. I think he walks in on Dean naked at least once or twice, in some state of undress, and then at the end, I love kind of the way that he ends the novel. He says, "And nobody knows what's going to happen to anybody besides the forlorn rags of growing old. I think of Dean Moriarty. I even think of old Dean Moriarty, the father we never found. I think of Dean Moriarty." And so he definitely seems to have a fixation, or he seems to be very much enamored by Dean, by his because Dean obviously took Sal's spontaneous approach to life to a whole new level. And I feel like throughout, throughout the novel, Sal is kind of trying to emulate Dean, maybe until the end where he sees how, how troubled Dean becomes. But I think he has this really special regard for him. And so I guess I was wondering, like, did Neal Cassady and Jack Kerouac, is there anything on the record of them potentially being lovers or having a romantic relationship?
There is not. As far as the record and anybody who's who knew them that would have been privy to that, they never had any sort of a romantic association. I mean, Neal was pretty unabashedly bisexual. I mean, there's the part in On the Road where he's sleeping with Ginsberg, and or I mean Carlo Marx, but same.
Right.
Notwithstanding, they did sleep together, and in fact, there was an incident where, after Neal was married to Carolyn Cassady, the character Camille, she wound up catching him in bed with Ginsberg, as well as with Luann Henderson, the character Mary Lou, and so he definitely Cassady swung both ways, and in fact he used to, kind of, one of his catchphrases was never knock the way the other guy swings. Mm-hmm. And Kerouac too had experiences with men, but as far as he and Cassady, it was always a platonic relationship. They just had a great admiration for one another. Neal admired Kerouac for his intellect and his ability as a writer. Kerouac, along with many other people, admired Neal for just being the larger than life person he was. He was, as the old adage goes, men wanted to be him, women wanted to be with him, and there's a lot of nuances in there, but yeah, he was certainly kind of a larger than life character, and so obviously they had this connection where what's kind of interesting. One of the sort of the themes throughout On the Road is that when they're together, they're almost like a singular character. Like Sal and Dean are like two sides of the same coin.
Mm-hmm.
And even that famous photograph that we have on the sign in the front of our building, with Jack and Neal arm in arm, that was taken up on Russian Hill in 1952. You kind of have to ask yourself, looking at them, they look like brothers. Like, people ask me all the time, which one's Neal and which one's Jack? Is it the one on the left, the one on the right? And there is a sense of them being kind of almost like the same person, at least in the context of that story. But yeah, they were never lovers.
Good to know. I was wondering.
They shared love occasionally, but
they did. Yeah. In the book they did, and that was another thing that I kept having to sort of like pinch myself and be like, no, this is not a book from the 70s, right? It's not the.
Makes you wonder sometimes.
Yes, it's not, but it was funny because I kept thinking that it was more of that He's Loved Donny Osmond era, right? Because it kept kind of having some of those kinds of themes that we tend to see come out of that era, and so it felt very avant-garde. I mean, maybe there was a lot more of that going on than you hear about in sort of the more Doris Day, Separate Beds, I Love Lucy, kind of the 50s and early 60s. This was a definite departure from that, and definitely very forward thinking and feeling. And I thought it was interesting too, because in the same breath of being very much like the "don't knock the way, man swings," which there also was a little bit of this homophobia thread that came up a little bit in the book, and I think that was it kind of touched on that sort of we contain multitudes within us, and I like how you mentioned that Neil and Jack are kind of two peas in a pod, and maybe represented different sides of their own personalities, that they had very very similar personalities, but then their differences kind of complemented each other, and that they maybe had or ended up kind of internalizing, maybe through their friendship, a lot of those same kinds of personality traits that made them very much identical. Interesting, very interesting. It has been such a pleasure, Brandon, getting to talk to you. I don't know if we'll be able to coax a poem out of you tonight, but I will link. The internet is a crazy place. You can find everything, so I might link, if you don't mind. I think I saw one about teardrops on concrete. Was that you or another Brandon?
That sounds like one of mine. That's okay. But a drop upon the concrete.
That's it. Yeah, I really liked that one. So if you won't perform it for us live tonight, I'll go ahead and, if you don't mind, share it.
Sure, yeah, I can do that for you. Let me find it here. Okay. It goes a little something like this. This is called But a Drop Upon the Concrete, and this is for our dearly departed friend Lisa. I noticed the tears you tried to hide in your reflection from the back seat, the city lights ahead, and with a sleeve you dried your eyes, you said, "I'm sorry. Though I've crossed this bridge after so many drives, the light still catches me sometimes, and that's how I know that I'm home. This is where you'd hang your hat," you said. "No further west beckons your feet, so why not leave some footprints on the beach and disappear inside a bottle? As the night descends without a star and the howling wind steals all your warmth and songs away. Through rain-glistened windows, the city is electric. Neon and glass smear together in slow exposure. Fire escapes cling to the brickwork, phoenix talons clawing upward toward the sky, and she takes my hand, hers coursed in a tarot of fraying lifelines, queen of cups running empty, but she smiles, one good eye shrink-wrapped in tears, belying all the years curled in doorways. Concrete never grows softer, but some hearts glow the brighter for their breakage, and bittersweetly you found someone to hold yours before the end will miss you always. Now I'm standing on the roof, foghorns in the distance bearing weary hulls to berth, and in the company of friends I'll swear my face was only wet from sea breeze, knowing too well just where the hell I've left my heart. So when you get here, pluck 2 petals from an asphalt flower. She loves you. Yeah, she loves you."
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that, Brandon. I really appreciate it. And sorry for spurring it on you, but I'm really sorry, not sorry, because that was absolutely beautiful. And to everyone tuning in, we will be reading next month Z, a novel of Zelda Fitzgerald by Therese Ann Fowler. And I think I'll have to add Brandon's recommendation to next year's list, and I'll also link to that below if you want to get a start on that. It sounds like Joyce, Zelda influenced Scott greatly in his writing, and so it will be interesting to read a little bit more about her, as she is perhaps the lesser known of the Fitzgeralds. So we're looking forward to that. Tune in next month. Thank you for joining. Have a wonderful evening.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Brandon. Take care. Bye.
Take care. Have a good evening.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay.